Information for Development Trust and I, as chair, would also like to thank the panelists for being here and for taking time out to be part of this very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Dr. Kwani Moyo, was unable to make it, but we only found out this morning. So the discussion this evening, we're going to reflect on the political opposition, reflections on freeness, fairness, and credibility of the 2018 elections. We were going to look at the issue of, is ZEC adequately and competently prepared for the forthcoming elections? Without a ZEC representative, I guess we'll have to speculate and kind of analyze and discuss that. Independent critical perspectives on the opposition's and civil society's campaign for free and fair elections, and the state of the media ahead of these elections. Let me start, before we get into the discussion, let me tell you a little bit about Information for Development Trust. It was formed in 2015 and started operating in mid-2016. The discussion on what it would be and the issues it would take up started long before that, actually. Tawanda Majoni, the director of IDT, and I and other colleagues talked about setting up an organization that focused on the media and on investigative journalism, but that it was connected to development. And how do we make the connection to development and ensure that we take the issues out into the public domain and then bring it back into the media sector? IDT is currently, as I said, we focused on investigative journalism, and that's currently what we are very active in implementing. I'm actually going to focus on electoral management and governance ahead of the elections. This dialogue is part of our programming and advocacy, and it seeks to enhance citizen participation in debating electoral transparency and accountability, and also garnering recommendations to optimize chances for free and fair elections. We'd also like to thank Kubutana, by the way, for helping disseminate the message about this dialogue through its online platform. We were going to have live streaming, but unfortunately that's not going to be possible. But we do urge you as participants to tweet, and the hashtag we were thinking of was hashtag IDT SAPES Dialogue. Zimbabwe's 2018 elections, perspectives on transparency and accountability. That is our topic tonight. As you know, announcements have been made, and especially this commitment was made at Davos by our president, where he announced that he would promulgate the dates once the current BVR process ends, and that apparently has ended today. The president has promised free, credible, and fair elections, but since independence, we all know that there's been lingering concerns about that. There still remains concerns about the voter's role, voter education, intimidation, and electoral reforms. So we feel that we need to continue unpacking these issues to determine if the electoral process will guarantee or undermine transparency, accountability, and integrity, and in turn, the freeness, fairness, and credibility of the coming polls. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. On the extreme right, I have Wellington Gadzikwa. He is currently a journalism and media lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe. Prior to that, he lectured in the Mass Communication Division at Harare Polytechnic. Wellington is a published scholar. On my immediate right is Tony Wheeler, a colleague. We've worked together, and very happily I miss working with Tony, actually. He's currently a senior researcher at Research and Advocacy Unit and an academic. Trained as a lawyer, Tony trained as a lawyer and psychologist, and has been active in mental health, human rights, and governance for the past 30 years. Within RAW, he focuses on issues around governance and active citizenship, and works with a range of civic initiatives, including the National Transitional Justice Working Group and the Tree of Life. He has published widely in the fields of mental health, torture, human rights, and governance. Tendayi Biti on my left, I think very well known, Zimbabwean advocate, activist and politician, and the former Zimbabwe Minister of Finance from 2009 to 2013. He was the Secretary General of the Movement for Democratic Change and also a founding member of MDC and a former Member of Parliament for Harare East. Thank you, panelists, for being here. And again, let me say thank you to Dr. Mandaza for having us here. And with that, I'd like to ask Tony to set the foundation for the discussion this evening.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening. My task was to talk about a critical independent perspective to get a free and fair election. And I have to say at the outset, I'm a real cynic when it comes to elections, generally, and specifically about Zimbabwe. Generally because I think what's been pushed by the governance forces in the world for many, many years now is that elections are such a fundamental guarantee of democracy. The alternation hypothesis is the one that everyone talks about. 2 free and fair elections in which government changes hands and you clearly are a democracy. Well, I don't think they knew it, but Zimbabwe wrote the manual on how to subvert that a very long time ago. So elections are now a major obsession with this country in the aftermath of the coup. It seems to be the way in which this coup is going to be cured. No other outcome will happen rather than an election, and a good, free and fair election, as Johanna just pointed out, will be the basis in which all the bad things that have happened in the last 3 months will go away. But when it comes to elections, the big question that I want to address specifically about this coming election is what kind of election do we think we're going to have? Because when it comes to elections, Zimbabwe has an extremely poor record of elections that are accepted either by Zimbabweans or generally by the international community. And even though the standards set by SADC and the AU, they have some very laudable principles and guidelines for the conducting of genuine, free and fair elections, they have a very poor record in applying those things with any rigor. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If you think about the elections, particularly in 2002 and 2008, and the response of SADC to those particular elections, their record is rather woeful. Some of you may be old enough to remember the 2002 election. There's a litany that we have that 2008 is the most violent election that we've ever had. I'd sometimes dispute that, having lived through the 2002 election and dealing with all the survivors. I think that was a really scary election because that election began somewhere like December 2000 with all the by-elections that happened. So the campaigning for that 2002 election was long and bloody all the way to that poll. And some of us even noticed that the polling day itself was not particularly non-violent. I remember getting a report from people being dragged out of a queue where they were trying to vote and taken off, and people tried to drown them in a dam, which seemed a very violent election. But our memories in Zimbabwe are a bit short. So I want to remind us, when we're talking about observation, about some of the things that the observers see. If you think about those 2 elections, both of those elections had investigations carried out at the behest of the South African government. The Kempepe Moseneke report on the violence in 2002 took civil society, took the Southern African Historical Archive, the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum, and the Mail and Guardian 6 years and an extraordinary amount of money to be able to finally get that report. In 2008, 2 generals came here and they took a report and they went away with boxes of information. We've never seen that report. And even more recently, the SADC Observer Mission report, we saw the preliminary findings that they have. We're on the cusp of another election. We've never seen SADC's report on 2013. So the point I'm wanting to make is that observation is critical to assessing the validity of elections, and it's critical that the observers are neutral, impartial, and publish the kinds of findings that they make. Without those things, we do not have neutral observation. And we have, in fact, had no neutral observation, if you might call it that, except selected observers since 2002. The EU, none of the external people have been allowed to observe. So that's very important when we come to these polls. And we're dealing with it in a situation, and a totally novel situation with this election. All elections since 2002 have been a two-horse race. It's largely been ZANU-PF versus MDCT. This is a very different situation now in the aftermath of the coup. And it's very worrying that as we go into this, from the international perspective, that there's extreme timidity about what you call what happened in November and December. A coup, a military-assisted transition, or do you use a more polite method of calling it a coup, and you could call it something like concern about military interference in the civilian affairs of the country. Now, which one you call it is very different. Some of you may have seen the EU statement on the way forward, where they talk about a political transition. There's no expression of concern about military interference in the civilian affairs of the state. It's just a political transition. So which of those three things you choose is important, because it has very serious implications, doesn't it? If you take the first one and have a coup, then very serious things happen, right? International action has to happen. You have to withdraw your diplomats from the country. You have to start thinking about whether you're going to the Security Council, etc., etc. That's a very serious step, and clearly people were unwilling to do that. The second one, calling it a military assisted transition, or as somebody said to me, isn't it just a palace coup, basically whitewashes the whole problem. And the third one, about expressing concern about interference of the military, could create space for serious consultations about what happens, including an election. Now, that first position we know has been avoided. Everybody, the diplomats will tell you we couldn't say that because it would possibly precipitate the country into deeper crisis. The second one, they decided the notion of military-assisted transition, they've decided is fairly simply cured by an election. That's okay. And regards that as well, you can see what goes with that as well is enormous expression about willingness to engage as fast as we possibly can and start talking about the future, prejudging the notion that this can and will be a free and fair election poll. Now, the point I want to make is that elections are going to take place in a country that already has a very poor election for violently contested elections. If you look at the data on elections around this region, Zimbabwe is far and away the most violent of all SADC countries, for sure. And our violence, interestingly, is concentrated around elections. It is very focused violence in Zimbabwe. And it's now going to also occur, because of the events that took place recently, in a country where the military has already intervened and is ensconcing itself more and more in the government and the civilian structure of the country. So the blunt question that has to be asked is, how probable is it that this new political arrangement can organize a genuinely free and fair election? And the additional question that Alex Magaisa asked recently in one of his big Saturday reads, how likely is it that they will concede and step down and accept a loss at the polls? And I'd take you back to 2008, where after 8 years of very complicated elections, we did have a result, a clear result. It might not have been constitutionally nice, but Morgan Tsvangirai had won the presidential poll and the MDC had won the election. What did not happen was a rush to say, suck it up, guys, you lost, hand over power. That did not happen. What they said was there's a constitutional arrangement that has to be followed, and then what happened was an exceedingly bloody rerun. And I personally think that Thabo and Becky and Sadek have a lot of complicity in the violence that took place. There was a responsible position and an irresponsible position, and they took the irresponsible position. Now, I'm raising them because they're not trivial questions. So firstly, there is a lot of rumor and speculation that ZANU-PF can easily win these elections. And I hear it. Simply hearing it from Zimbabweans, from foreigners, the opposition is useless. That's a word that's said. They're useless and leaderless, etc., etc. And therefore they're not in a situation to be able to compete. And actually ZANU-PF can win this election in a free and fair way because of the disorganization of the opposition. But it's not the same as previous elections. ZANU-PF is not coherent anymore. It's fighting against multiple parties, both outside itself and within itself. It is not insignificant that there are factions within ZANU-PF that are being displaced, and we have no idea what their constituency might be. So there might well be a very complicated vote taking place in this election. And it's possible, and you could argue, that ZANU-PF, the new ZANU-PF, might do not very well in Matabeleland. They might not do very well in the metropolitan areas. And they might even not do terribly well in the Mashonaland provinces and the Mikoland provinces. That depends on the voters. And I take you back again to 2008 and the first poll, where it is abundantly clear that what happened, and particularly in the presidential poll, but also in the House of Assembly polls, that people voted against ZANU-PF. The hardship they'd been through, Murambachina, their dissatisfaction, got people to vote against ZANU-PF. Need to be stated as really important. And Ibo and I tried to put these out in a piece in The Independent about 2 weeks ago, and I want to restate those. And these things must be stated clearly and soon. And the opposition political parties must make them time-bound. They must be time-bound. You cannot demand the reforms and say, we want these reforms. They must be done, and done by when. That's how you negotiate. The first one is what we call security sector containment. In the aftermath of a coup, with the military now ensconced increasingly in the state and the political party, it is very clear there must be containment of the security sector. And we suggested that what should happen is that all the security sector chiefs should make public statement they will adhere to the Constitution and the laws by which that govern their respective centres. They must say that public to the whole nation. But that's not enough. There must be set up a multi-party monitoring team to check that that in fact happens. Are soldiers deployed here? What is going on in the communities? And we suggest that those monitoring teams should include SADC people to watch. We'd say the same thing about traditional leaders. We'd say traditional leaders must make a clear and unequivocal commitment to the Constitution and to the Traditional Leaders Act, that they are non-partisan and they will adhere to the Constitution and the Act. And that should be cascaded right out through the communities. And there must be a monitoring group going out there of multi-parties to ensure that that is being done, again accompanied by a SADC observer. The impartiality of the ZEC Commission, it needs to be made more transparent. We have a new chairperson on the way. We would suggest that that person should be tied to a SADC person to observe, as it was in Cadessa during the South African process. There was an observer making sure that the game was being played fairly.
Tony, thank you. Very concise, but also you contextualize that very well against the backdrop of the 2002 landscape, 2008, and now post-2017 events. Thank you so much for that. You've also laid out very clearly what we should be expecting. You talk about very different landscape with far more players than we've seen in the past. You also mentioned the violence, and that has been a critical issue in past elections, especially, I thought you'd talk about women, but I'm sure you can mention it later. I'd like to call upon Wellington Katsikwe, but before I do that, I just want to point out to the audience here, today, UNESCO had a colloquium in Paris where they talked about improving the communications and information ecosystem to protect the integrity of elections. They were discussing the impact of social media and internet providers on political communication and ways of strengthening the integrity of electoral processes in collaboration with national electoral bodies. There was more of a Twitter feed than there was, articles on the present.
It's also the responsibility of the media to make sure that there's transparency and accountability in terms of elections. Elections are not, it's not an event, it's a process. So the media should actually focus on all the periods, election, pre-election, and post-election. And the media should also be able to question and query all through these processes, and so that we have transparency and accountability by playing the watchdog role. But what we see in our situation is that we see the media playing different roles away from the watchdog role. They also play the lapdog role, backdog role, guard dog roles. For the public media, for example, they cannot question ZEC and all this process because they are becoming part and parcel of what they are supposed to question. And one thing that I would want to look at is that we hear that after the military action, coup, or whatever you may choose to call it, or the current arrangement, there are so many names to what happened in this country, depending on who you are. Is that there's a feeling that you could see on television, the ministers coming there to talk about making promise about free and fair elections with the president, but what was obtaining before the elections is still obtaining. And one question that we need to ask ourselves is that can the current arrangement guarantee space for media through reforms, or simply can the current arrangement put in place a system which has the potential to leave them powerless? Can they legislate themselves out of power? So when we hear about the reforms, we need to be very careful about the genuineness of these reforms, because media is key to ensuring that there's transparency and accountability by querying, questioning the whole election process and the management process like that we have. And one of the conditions for fair elections is equal access to publicly controlled media. So far, we have not seen anything that have changed since the coming in of the new arrangement that we have. And also, there hasn't been anything that shows that we have an independent and impartial electoral commission. So in terms of what the media can do and the state of the media, if I can go quickly to that, is that the media is the window, is the public sphere. They communicate what is happening, and it must have credibility. So there are two issues. There's what the media has done itself, which makes it not credible, and there's also the environment, which makes the media also not credible. We still have the first point that I would like to talk about is what I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, is the concept of tabloidization. We have seen that our media is a strong appetite for the sensational stuff, and this has conditioned our people, the audiences, to have a taste for this. So when instead of looking at critical issues, the media sometimes goes for the for the sensational aspects, which in any way does not contribute to its role, watchdog role in terms of ensuring transparency and accountability. We still have a polarized media, and once we have this polarization, it means that the media are taking positions and failing to unpack. Once they are taking fixed position, it means that it also limits its role in ensuring that we have transparency and credibility. And we also, there's a legacy of fear. Despite what has happened, I'm sure journalists are not yet quite clear whether they can do their work in a way that will guarantee that their safety. And also another issue is about inadequate resources, because from what we get, that most people, a larger percentage of the voters are in the rural areas. So do we have, does the media have enough resources to cover those areas? How do we get reports of what's going on there so that we can look at this process and say it's free and fair and so forth? So our media does not have resources to deploy journalists there. And also, although we talk about citizen journalism and online and so forth, we cannot have a guarantee that these will come in handy to do the set of questions that we have. We still have, despite the promises, the laws that were there that can tell how the media should work still in place. So until we have these laws repealed, reformed and so forth, then we can talk about the media playing a role, a much bigger role in this in the elections. From a recent study that was done by media monitors, they also people were not happy that they could get most of the information from about the coup from outside media, which also relied on foreign media, which relied on WhatsApp, all these social media aspects. It means also it's a reflection that there was fear of on the part of the journalists to do their job. And also issue of safety of journalists is another issue that has not been addressed. How safe are the journalists in covering elections? As we know that most violence has been pointed takes place during elections. So we are also another area is about community radios. We still have there are no community radio stations to debate and to disseminate all this information. And also we still have a monopoly of airwaves because we don't have genuine reforms in terms of television and radio. What we have are commercial radio stations, which are one way linked to the people in powerful groups and so forth, and the ability of the media to question, to take the electoral bodies and the whole electoral management to task. It's greatly handicapped if we look at it vis-a-vis what constitutes free and fair elections and the role that the media should do. And we also have issues to do with corruption and unethical practices. How can we trust our journalists? Can we trust our people in this environment where maybe corruption is a rule, not an exception? And what has been going on throughout the years, really, can we really expect the media to do its job properly? So in terms of the state of the media, I think the media is not prepared, and under the current conditions, it will not play its proper role in terms of ensuring that there's transparency and accountability, because its ability to question, query, is undermined by a lot of factors that are currently obtaining in the country. I saw a letter by the MDC Alliance to the effect that they were having their rallying challenge to invite ZBC to come and cover. But I'm sure ZBC didn't go there and cover. So what we see is well, nothing really fundamental has changed, except if people say they are tweeting, they're on WhatsApp, they're on these things, but the actual role of the media is still, the situation that was there is still obtaining in terms of the impediments on the media to play its oversight role in terms of elections. I'm sure I can end here and expect questions.
Thank you very much for that. What came out clearly from both speakers is the partisanship of critical stakeholders in upholding integrity and ensuring a credible process. You have the security sector, your traditional leadership, ZEC, the state media, which is not acting in terms of public interest, the monopoly of the airwaves. Our widest reaching medium on the African continent is radio and television, and we rely heavily on the state media, who does not act as a public media. And I think you asked, in the context of corruption, which in Zimbabwe is incredibly high, you asked a critical question: can we trust journalists? Thank you. Mr. Biti, over to you.
Thank you, Sunanda. Good evening, compatriots, fellow Zimbabweans, and Dr. Mandas. Sekuru Mandas. So I want to thank you, SAPES and Information for Development, for inviting me to this platform and these conversations. I like the conversations that SAPES has started in 2018. They're very critical, because 2018, I think, is going to be a very critical year for Zimbabweans. And I think that in the post-coup scenario, in the post-coup matrix, there is a deliberate attempt to flatten all of us. There's a deliberate attempt to make all of us think like the junta and behave like the junta. So if you've got a different opinion, they are trying to crucify you. We refuse that narrative, and I'm very happy that SAPES continues to be the forum it has been for many years of allowing alternative voices. So I'm going to have a very frank discussion on the 2018 election. And I've divided my talk into three parts, which will be self-evident to you as I address. The first aspect, the first thing that I want to deal with is the context of Zimbabwe's elections over the years. You'll be shocked to know that since 1980, we have had 12 elections in Zimbabwe. That means that every 3 years and 8 months, we've had an election in Zimbabwe. Which is just too much. The obsession with elections in Zimbabwe, the electrocentric obsession in Zimbabwe is not justified. It is not justified because the outcome of those elections have not delivered any meaningful substantive change. Elections have been there to reinforce a status quo, to cement a status quo. There are two scholars that I like very much, Levitsky and Way, who have written a book or books on what they call electoral authoritarianism. And this describes a situation where a country goes through the pretense of normative elections, but elections that simply serve to reproduce the status quo ante. And that is what we have witnessed in the last 37 years, regrettably. There's also an attempt in 2018 to frame the 2018 election as the end-all and the be-all. There's an attempt to frame everything as if history will begin after the 2018 election, which is unfortunate. because an election based on the polity, based on the matrices of the previous elections that we've had since 1980, we all know it won't change anything. And yet, this is a country that is crying out for real transformation. This is a country that is crying out for real change. This is a country in which we are all united in one thing, that it can't be business as usual, that we need a major paradigm. But the election itself per se will not be the cause of that paradigm. And which is why some of us, including my friends Tony Rila and Dr. Mandaza, were arguing that we needed a national transitional authority, because the National Transitional Authority offered a forum in respect of which, as a nation, as Zimbabwe, we were going to recraft, reinvent, renew the idea of Zimbabwe as a nation state. What do we mean by Zimbabwe as a nation state? If I were to give you a small little piece of paper, as we used to do in university, and ask you to write your own idea, your own conception of Zimbabwe as a nation state, you'll be shocked by your answers. Some will say it's Dynamos winning the league this year. We don't have that common vision. The National Transitional Authority offered us an opportunity of sculpturing a vision. I hear the new Junda, this new Junda, I hear them talk about investment, talk about attracting a business and so forth. But within what context? Within what vision? To arrive at what destination? So the paucity, the kwashioka of ideas, the kwashioka of a vision is so self-evident. And that's the problem I have in Zimbabwe. Everything is so short-term, and short-termism is the order of the day. So the long-term trajectory is not there. So 37 years have been totally wasted by a very tired and very arrogant a nationalist class. Frantz Fanon wrote about it in The Wretched of the Earth, chapter 4 of that book, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Nationalism was designed for one thing and one thing alone, which is the idea of one man, one vote. And they meant it literally. But beyond the nationalist aspiration goal, nationalism does not have the capacity, the ability, the means of transforming the nation state. Nationalism is clueless about the economy, for instance. Nationalism is clueless about the intricacies of international law and international relations. And Zimbabwe is exhibit A of the limitations of nationalism, is the limitations of tired nationalism. So I want to say a point that I've made before, that what has kept this regime in power for the last 37 years has been three things: coercion, capture, and corruption. So coercion has just been physical violence. We saw physical violence in 1980. And part of the problem is the fact that for all intents and purposes, we've always been a securocratic state. For all intents and purposes, we've always been a militarized state. And one of our challenges is that in 1980, from the 60s to 1979, there was a war in this country. So you had the guerrilla movement representing the aspirations of us, the black people. And then you had, of course, the colonial regime and its colonial army. So at independence, two armies did a power transfer. The minority army gave way to the majority army represented by the liberation movement. But the problem with this post-independent army is that it didn't demobilize, it didn't demilitarize. So at any given stage, it has always behaved as an army. And an army, when faced with any problems, it will resort to what it knows best, which is the gun. So if you look systematically at ZANU-PF's response or the state's response to conflict or challenges in the last 37 years, it has always been a militaristic response. So one of the first challenges that the regime faced was in 1982, when you had what has since been known to be classified or described as the dissident problem. The challenges that took place in the camps, particularly at Connemara and so forth. That was met by a military response, an excessive military response, which left 30,000, 20,000 of our compatriots dead, which we now call a Gukuraundi. So it was a military response. Any other body polity elsewhere, most of us here would have said, let's have a dialogue. Let's have a dialogue, because that's what Democrats do. But military people don't dialogue. They dialogue with the gun, they dialogue with the bullet. So that's the first form, that's the first response to a threat. That's the first response to a threat. There were other misadventures, for instance, the war in the DRC in the late 1997. Any other polity would have said, let's go to the UN, let's go to the OAU then at the time and resolve the problem in the bulk of Africa. Let's put DRC on the table. Let's call Rwanda, let's call Angola, let's call Uganda, and let's have dialogue. But soldiers would say, no, let's sort it out, let's fight. And that's what they did. Then you had the land reform issue in 2000, which again was a genuine aspiration that was militarized. The thousands of people that were displaced, the thousands of people that were killed did not have to die if there'd been a civilian polity and a civilian mindset on the table. Because the state had the power to effect land reform through the law. But they didn't. Between 1980 and 1999, the ZANU-PF government had only acquired 3.5 million hectares of land. Of that 3.5 million hectares of land, 3.2 million hectares of land was acquired between 1980 and 1985, when we had the restrictive willing buyer, willing seller clause in our constitution, section 16 of the then constitution of Zimbabwe. But when we removed willing buyer, willing seller, we only acquired 0.2 million hectares of land. So the issue in 2000 then was never about meeting the genuine aspiration and desire for land, but another agenda, and that agenda requires militarization. And I would argue, as many have argued, that it was a response to the win by the opposition in the constitutional referendum of 11 March 2000. Then, of course, you had 2008. Even before you went to 2008, you had Operation Murambachina in 2005. Another unnecessary physical response to an issue that was on the ground. 2008 was clear, a preemptive coup and a very violent coup. Tony says there were more people that died in 2002 than in 2008. I cannot contest that. But what I can testify, because I saw it with my own eyes, is the extreme levels of violence at both instances in 2000, 2002, and in 2008. We lost countless people in both instances. So these are the challenges which we had before November 2017. November 2017 creates another challenges on top of the mountain of challenges that we have. And after November of 2017, Zimbabwe will never be the same again. 2017 November redefined the entire political landscape of Zimbabwe. It will never be the same again. Because we have the blatant entry of the army in the political landscape of Zimbabwe. I find it strange that we debate whether it was a coup or not a coup. It's no brainer. It was a military coup. If it is fluffs like a duck, walks like a duck, squawks like a duck, it's a duck. So I'm a constitutional lawyer. So let me deal with it from the Constitution. The Constitution says in section 208 that the operational deployment of troops, and I want to underline the word operation. Operation means day-to-day activity. The operational deployment of the securocrats in Zimbabwe is the responsibility of the commander-in-chief, also known as the president. So the president is responsible for whether a tank is moving from KG6 to one commando, at the airport road. So if a tank moves from one KG6 to one commando without the consent and knowledge of the president, it's a coup, because it's a usurpation of the power of the president given by him in terms of section 108 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. So the Constitution is very clear the command of the securocrats is under an elected civilian authority called the president plus parliament. So parliament and the president did not invite the tanks that were outside parliament in Nelson Mandela Avenue and that were outside the president's office, which was barricaded, by the way, on the 14th, 15th, 16th, until the president resigned on the 21st of November in the year of our Lord 2017. So it is a coup. It is a coup. But having said that, we must also acknowledge that we identified with certain aspects of what happened in November. We came out in our numbers on the 18th of November 2017 because we wanted to close the chapter. We wanted to see the departure of Robert Mugabe. But that desire can never be confused with an endorsement, number one, of a military coup, more so an endorsement of the junta and Emmerson Mnangagwa. It's criminal to try and confuse the two. It's criminal to find synchronicity between the two processes, because they're not synchronized at all. There's no common purpose at all between these two actions. The two actions are separate. So we had nothing to do with what happened at the ZANU-PF Central Committee on Sunday, the 19th of November, 2017. We had nothing to do with that. Was not our fight. And in fact, those of you who were at Zimbabwe grounds will recall the boos that were given to Patrick Namasa the minute he said, I'll come here to represent ZANU-PF. But that was not our baby. That was our thing, and our thing was that President Mugabe, thank you very much. Ziko Mokwambiri, Twalumba Loko, Asante Sana. Please go. Merci beaucoup. That's what we wanted to do. That's what we wanted to do. So the two must never be confused. So we come now to the post-coup scenario, which has brought extremely dangerous situations in Zimbabwe. Extremely dangerous situations. The first one is the attempt to impose ethno-nationalism in this country. You cannot. I know that in the 37 years of Mugabe's rule, there is ample justification of arguing against the if you like, the Zezurunization or Zezuru hegemon. But you don't answer a wrong with a wrong. Yeah. This idea that every other position, I said on one of my tweets that if Zimbabwe was a law firm, if the post-coup Zimbabwe was a law firm, it would be called Moyo Sibanda and Associates. But that's not good enough. That is not, don't send us into Kenya. Don't make certain ethnic group feel alienated and reified to such an extent that they will be forced to organize at that primitive ethno-nationalistic level. It's very regrettable. It's very unacceptable. The second dangerous trait, I've already mentioned it, the attempt to make us all a box, the attempt to flatten us. And I've seen it on Twitter, that if you speak critical of the regime, it's some kind of heresy, it's some kind of treason. It is not. We spoke out against Robert Mugabe. We will speak out against the junta. We will speak out against Emmerson Mnangagwa. But if he does well, we'll say, yeah, we are watching. But that's what we do. That's what is normal in a democracy. And we are Democrats. We are Democrats. We will continue speaking out, but that is our DNA. And no one, let alone this one, will ever quieten us. He won't. So for me, the other template is the international community, or certain sections of the international community. They can't speak for us. They can't know what we want, because we know what we want. And what we want ourselves is genuine democracy in our country, the capacity to choose the people who act and represent us. That's what we want. So I find it ironic in some sectors that the new buzzword now is stability. The new buzzword now is reform. Reform not defined to include political reform, but economic reform, I call it an economecentricity approach. So yes, we can repeal the Indigenization Empowerment Act. Yes, we can attract foreign direct investment. Yes, we can go to Davos, and then suddenly it's amen, it's hallelujah. It is not. And I find this ironic coming from certain quarters, for instance, the British, who know more than democrats than most of us. After all, they came up with the Magna Carta way back in the 1300s. And in the last 3 years alone, the British themselves have had 3 elections. The election of 2015 that elected David Cameron. The referendum of 23 June 2016. And Mrs. Theresa May's election of the 8th of May 2017. 3 elections. So if it's good for the British, surely it ought to be good enough for us as well. We want democracy. We want the right to choose our country. There are some who have written off 2018, who think that ZANU-PF is going to win. What naivety, what abandonment of responsibility and thinking, if I might say so myself. There are certain factors that are going to be decisive in this election. There are certain factors that are going to be decisive in this election. The first one is the economy. And the economy doesn't lie. You can put up tanks against the sitting president, but you can't put tanks against the economy. And since November 2017, the economy has actually tanked. It's Armageddon. Where monthly inflation is now back to 80%. All of you shop. If you were using $100 last month, you are not using $100 this month. You all know what I'm talking about. So month-on-month inflation is now 80%. And any economist in this room will tell you that that's the technical definition of hyperinflation, when month-on-month inflation is now gone to 80%. We are living this. We don't have to be told by Zimstat that our inflation is 3%, because we are the ones who are being raped by ravaging prices in the supermarkets. Then you've got the liquidity crisis. None of us can get a single dollar from our supermarket. I was reading the monetary policy statement, which says that plastic money was 95 billion US dollars. Sorry, $95 billion. How is that possible? It's possible because it's fictitious money. It's possible because we're operating a Ponzi scheme. When we use our debit cards or when we use EcoCash, it's just hot air that is transferring between the accounts. When you go to a gas station and use your debit card to buy fuel, it's a normative hot air transaction. The gas station's account will be credited and your account will be debited, but no real value is exchanged hands. So you now have the ridiculous situation only had in Zimbabwe, where broad money supply is now around $12 billion. And the percentage of that cash is less than 2%. The stock exchange, the market capitalization of the stock exchange, as I'm talking to you right now, is $15 billion. But our GDP is $12 billion. Now, the stock exchange houses less than 20 companies. How can 20 companies, including Philip Chiangwa's Zeko, which used to manufacture shoes, but I don't know what they're manufacturing now. How can the stock exchange be more valuable than the entire economy? It's a fiction. It's a feja. So they're running the Ponzi scheme of an economy. So the economy is going to be a factor, and we're going to use it. The second thing that is going to be key, the Mnangagwa people are stealing from our hymn book. They are talking about the issues that we've traditionally talked about. So this election, more than any other election, is going to be an election contested on ideas. Ideas around the economy, ideas around transforming the state, transforming the body politic of our country. That's traditional opposition terrain. Their terrain has been land, sanctions, and nationalism and indigenization. So they're coming into our territory. So we're going to fight that war. I mean, the process of writing the MDC Alliance manifesto, it's going to be a war, and a war we are ready for. The third thing is, of course, the demographics. 69% of our population are below the age of 35. This young generation, including the millennials, who, by the way, if you do a demographic breakdown of the 6 million or so that were registered up until Monday, you actually see the rise of these millennials. The same youngsters that we were on the streets on the 18th of November 2017. And this Twitter generation has got high aspirations. They want real change. They want real transformation. They want jobs, not selling juice cards. And because of the media allows them to transcend their spatial boundaries. They are in Zimbabwe, but they are not in Zimbabwe. If you ask them what's happening in Hollywood, they will tell you, because of technologies allow them to break the boundaries of domestic space, the spatial boundaries. Number 4, a major critical factor in this election is going to be the state of the political parties. Now I want to talk about the opposition first. There is an exaggeration about these arguments. The opposition is divided and so forth. There are 76 political parties in Zimbabwe. 76. But when you strip all those 76, you will not find more than 7 serious political parties. So the question is, can those serious parties find each other? And I have no doubt in my mind in the work that we are doing in the MDC Alliance. And if you look at what we are doing, the reconnection is there. The masses are coming out. Look carefully what we are doing, and look carefully at our messaging. So we have been here before. In 2008, we were totally written off. Dr. Mandaza will tell you this. On the 1st of February 2008, the two MDCs failed to unite at Pandari Lodge. On the 5th of February 2008, Dr. Simbamakoni loaned Mavambo Kusile Dawn. And we didn't have money in the bank. So the little money which we had, we used to print t-shirts and pretended we had money. But we created a momentum. A momentum which reached a crescendo such that we won the election hands down in 2008. So we have been here before. We have been in this space before where there's a total write-off. But you cannot write off the people's aspirations for change. You cannot write off the people's suffering, because this people's suffering makes them hungry for change. And we know that because we are living with the communities. But let's talk about our opponent. I think Tony was very clear and correct that the ZANU we know died and disappeared on the 14th and 15th of November 2017. Even that one had been reconfigured by the expulsion of Joyce Mijuru and others in December of 2014. So you now have how many factions? You now have Gamma Talks and G40. They're out. You now have unhappiness in the current status quo in the party. And I like this observation of the move away from the party. The move away from. If you look at the agenda right now at ZANU-PF, they don't discuss primary elections. They discuss the economy, how prices are increasing. Because the traditional political party business have moved away from Rotten Row to KG6. And it's not an accident that the commissar is Engelbert Rugeje, whom they put there because they knew they couldn't leave him there. Because you could do what others did on the 14th of November. So they had to take him away. So then let's talk about the state of the state as well. Let's talk about the state of the state. I've spoken about the state of ZANU-PF. Let's talk about the state of the state. I see a very divided state, a very unhappy bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is unhappy because it has been taken over by the military. 60% of officials in the National Prosecuting Authority are soldiers. I shan't talk about other ministries that I know too well. You know that ministry, because I know what's happening there. But the army is essentially taken off. Then you have got the disquiet in the ranks of the police. Then you've got disquiet in the ranks of the intelligence organizations who are being fired left, right, and center, primarily on one criteria, your ethnicity, which again is regrettable. So the state doesn't have the same cohesiveness that allowed it to deliver the preemptive coup of 2008. I shall not repeat what I've said, but I've said a very heavy thing. There's this cohesion in the state. Another driver. This is the first election that ZANU-PF will fight without Robert Mugabe. And so if the big shoes of Robert Mugabe are going to be filled by a character that doesn't have charisma, we are going to play on that, let me assure you. Particularly if this character has been associated with all the ugly episodes of our history in this country, whether it's Gugura Wundu, whether it's 2008. And the opposition are going to say it as it is. If you butchered our people, we're going to say you butchered our people. And that's going to be an election factor. Another key issue in this election is ICT, information, communications, and technology, in particular social media. We know that they are employing 300 people, largely from Iran and other countries, on Twitter. If you see someone trolling you on Twitter, he or she doesn't have a name. They've got numbers like X00003. That's deliberate. But that's going to be a war. That is going to be a war. Social media is going to be a key driver in this particular election. The last driver is going to be the church. The church is going to be key. The church is going to be key in its various manifestations. And I think that the traditional church will remain traditional with their traditional vote. It is the Pentecostals that may have a problem. Some of them are criminals, so they may have a problem. But the church is going to play a key role in this election. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the most important election that most of us here are fighting. The 1980 election was key. It was redefining our post-colonial history. But this election is the election of our generation. It's the most important election that we are going to fight. Because if we get it wrong, then the junta will be around with us for at least 20 years. Fortunately, what we are seeing on the ground is another story. And which is why I have no doubt in my mind that the issue of violence is going to be a factor in this election. The issue of violence is going to be a factor because when they planned this coup, they didn't plan this coup in order to lose power in July or August of 2017. They've been marrying designer wives. They've been sending themselves to school. They are now more per capita PhDs at the army than anywhere else. And they were not getting those PhDs in order to get a job at Econet or Delta Corporation. They were getting those degrees in order to lay their hands on the state. So this is going to be a fight of our life. So now let me conclude now by purely technical issues. What we expect, the demands that we are making, and we'll be launching a document very soon. Number one, it is pointless to go to this election without dialogue and discussion around the military. Because unless you deal and understand with what happened in 2014, November, that election is pointless because there's nothing that will stop the tanks from moving again, no matter who has been elected in July of 2018. So it's critical that we find an answer to making sure that the barrack remains sealed off from interference with but that's the elephant in the living room. The election is academic unless we resolve the fundamental basis of November 2014. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And how can we stop it never happening? And this question is key because whenever the boys come out, it tends to be cyclical and self-reproducing. Ask people in Ghana, ask people in the Central African Republic, ask people in Nigeria. When you test, you want to test more. And these guys tested in November 2017. They will want to test more. So we need to resolve this as a country. And I don't think we can resolve this without help from the international community. The second thing technically is the voters' roll. The voters' roll has to be audited by all of us. We have to prevent contamination of the new BVR voters' roll by the voters' roll that was used in 2013, which by now we still do not have in electronic form. Only in Zimbabwe do you have a situation where 2 months to go to the next election, you don't have the electoral roll that was used in the previous election. How do you do your quantitative and qualitative analysis without it? It's crazy, but that's the reality. So our biggest fear as opposition is how do we stop the contamination of the new BVR voters roll with the old one, particularly when we know that not even ZEC itself has got control of its servers. The servers at KG6 controlled by a company called Nikuf. So it's dicey. Number two, the military must issue the statement. Tony mentioned it. The statement that they will respect the constitution and salute whosoever is elected after July of 2018. That statement is important because it goes beyond symbolism. In other words, they must revisit the Zunavache Declaration of 2002. Because without it, it's just a joke. So this is key. Number three, they have to be constitutional and legislative reforms. The obvious ones are the repeal of POSA, the repeal of IPA, and of course major amendments to the Electoral Act. And the key amendment to the Electoral Act, among the key amendments to the Electoral Act is the proscription, the prevention of the use of the notorious voter registration slip, which killed us off in 2013. You remember the voter registration slip. So there must be amendments in the Electoral Act dealing with that. Also, the special vote, Section 8 of the Electoral Act. They've tried to remove it, but they've reverted that to the old postal vote, which is no improvement. So we have to stop that because Section 8 allows some people, the securocrats, to vote before the main election. And that is not on because we were abused by it in 2013. I would like to see Section 212 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe amended. But Section 12 is what the soldiers use when they say we can do it, we will defend Zimbabwe. But defending Zimbabwe has limitations. It's defending Zimbabwe against external threats. The way it is worded right now is that we can defend Zimbabwe against any threat. I used to sit in the National Security Council when I was in government. And part of the problem I realized with the securocrats in Zimbabwe is that they confused ZANU-PF interests with the national interests. And so threats to ZANU-PF became national threats against the national interest. But the two are separate. So I would like to see Section 212 amended, among other constitutional amendments, before the election. Number 5 is the diaspora. Section 67 of the Constitution is very clear. Every citizen has a right to vote. They surely should have a right to vote. And Tony suggested very simple, let's introduce proportional representation. Then it doesn't matter about the Constitution. I'm also not convinced about an earlier judgment given by the current Chief Justice, albeit interpreting the old Constitution. I know that right now the Constitutional Court is hearing arguments about diaspora vote in respect of the new Constitution. But our Section 67 is worded word for word with Section 33 of the South African Constitution. And the South African Constitutional Court, which we have to respect because it knows the law, has said, look, they've got a right to vote. So I hope our Constitutional Court will follow suit. Next, and very key, very, very key, is the ballot paper. We have to know who is going to print the ballot paper, what paper is actually going to be used. Because with modern technologies, paper can mutate once you have done your vote. So the ballot paper is going to be very key in this election. Then, of course, the issue of international observers. There has to be international observers which have to come now, NAMCLA. They have to come now, months before the election, if they have to play a meaningful role. Next is the role of the UN. Tony put it differently. Tony proposed peacekeepers. We are proposing the role of the UN. The UN must have both a technical role and a supervisory role in this country. And we believe that if the UN is going to play that insurance role, you might not need peacekeepers. But I think the logic, the starting point is the same. We need the UN to play a special role in this election. And as MDC Alliance, we've already started talking with the UN. Next, of course, is the media reforms, which my friend was talking about. There has to be equal access to the media. This business that you give broadcasting licenses to Superman Dwanzira and other broke ZANU-PF people is not good enough. We have to have equal access to the media. Next is security of the person. Security of the person. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is going to be a violent election. I would like Emerson to prove me wrong, but I want to contend that this is going to be a violent election. So the security of the person is going to be key. Next is the security of the vote. In 2013, we had a problem. In 2008, one of the things we did so well was to protect the security of the vote. So we had an excellent parallel voter tabulation system. The election was on the 28th of March 2008, and many of you remember that by 11 a.m. on the 29th of March 2008 at Miku's Hotel, I was able to announce the result of the election and to declare that Morgan Tsvangira has won. In 2013, they didn't allow us to do that. They totally denied us access to the vote. We need to control that. The Electoral Act actually says our election has to be audited by 4 auditors. But that is a provision that is complied in breach, not in execution. So that is not good enough. So these are some of the things that we feel are so key: the security of the voter, the security of the vote itself, the security of the result itself. But I need to end. I'm not ending. I need to end by saying that the election comes and goes within one day. The challenges facing Zimbabwe are beyond an election. They are beyond an election. And for some of us, we needed a framework, a platform in which these issues were to be put on the table, a solution found, and that's why some of us remained serious adherents to the National Transitional Authority. But we are where we are right now, and as a member of the MDC Alliance, I've absolutely no doubt that we will be, as opposition, we will be able to give our people a real chance in this election, and that we will be able to stop the encroachment of the junta on our body politic. I thank you very much.